Have you ever been surrounded by people who carry your same last name and felt completely erased? While her family's laughter ricocheted off those lifeless walls, Jade kept her gaze pinned to her own lap. Her entire inheritance, after years of being the only soul who genuinely cared for her eccentric Aunt Bea, amounted to one thing: a single tarnished, dust-choked mirror. They called it garbage. They stared at her like she was the punchline to a joke they'd been rehearsing for decades. But none of them understood Aunt Bea's silence, and not one of them suspected that the most precious things in this world are sometimes buried beneath deliberate ruin. The surviving members of the Gallagher bloodline filled that conference room, a family drowning in legacy, bone dry of love. Jade Harrington sat closest to the door, fingers knotted tight against her thighs. 32 years old, the youngest person in that room by a wide margin, and almost certainly the only one who had wept real tears when Beatrice Gallagher stopped breathing. Aunt Bea had been a fierce, peculiar woman who rattled around alone inside a crumbling Victorian mansion in Salem. The rest of the family spent their time whispering about Bea's eroding mind and running cold calculations on her net worth. Jade spent her Sundays sipping lukewarm Earl Grey in Bea's dust-coated parlour, absorbing wild stories about the 1960s art world and voyages across continents. Directly across the table sat her older brother Darius. He glanced at his Rolex every 3 minutes. His tailored Italian suit practically vibrated with hungry expectation. Beside him, their cousin Sylvia, dragging crimson lipstick across her mouth with the vacant detachment of someone killing time at a delayed gate. Attorney Harrison Caldwell, a man who appeared older than the leather-bound volumes stacked along his shelves, cleared his throat. He adjusted his half-moon spectacles. Then he cracked the seal on a thick manila envelope resting in front of him. ___0___ Caldwell began. His voice was dry as cracked parchment. The room turned to stone. Darius straightened, his wrist forgotten. Sylvia snapped her compact shut. Aunt Bea's estate had long been the subject of breathless speculation. Old shipping money, shrewd mid-century real estate plays, and a stock portfolio she guarded like a state secret. As Caldwell waded through the legal preamble, Jade let the language blur into noise. Her mind wandered to that familiar scent, lavender, braided with old paper, that trailed Bea wherever she went. She wasn't bracing for anything grand. Darius had always been the golden child, the assumed heir to the Gallagher fortune. Sylvia had spent years burrowing into the good graces of Bea's financial advisors. All Jade wanted was a keepsake. One of Bea's old fountain pens, maybe. A photo album. Caldwell read, his gaze travelling across the dense print. Darius exhaled hard through his nose. A smug, conquering grin spread across his face. He had his empire. Jade braced for whatever scraps remained. He fired a triumphant glance at Sylvia. ___3___. Caldwell continued, entirely unmoved by the silent gloating. ___4___. Sylvia released a small, airless gasp. Her hands floated to her chest. She had seized the glittering prize she'd coveted since she was a teenager. Caldwell paused. He turned the page. Silence swelled through the room, thick, suffocating. Jade shifted in her chair, already mapping her quiet exit once the formalities dissolved. "And finally," Caldwell said, his brow creasing slightly, as though verifying the words printed before him, "to my great niece, Jade Harrington." Darius and Sylvia both turned toward her. Darius's eyes narrowed to slits. Sylvia looked faintly entertained. Quote 7. Caldwell read, his voice flattening into something oddly careful. Quote 8. The room went hollow. Jade blinked. The mirror? She knew that piece well. It was a massive, threatening thing, nearly 8 feet tall, framed in dense, dark mahogany, carved deep with Gothic scrollwork that seemed designed to intimidate. The silvering on the glass had flaked and blotched with decades of neglect, turning every reflection wavy, ghostly, wrong. By any honest measure, it was an ugly piece of furniture. Then a sound cracked through the silence. A scoff, sharp, deliberate. Darius rocked back in his leather chair and erupted into full, belly-deep laughter, a cruel, booming sound that ricocheted off the wood-panelled walls. Half a heartbeat later, Sylvia joined him. Her giggle was high-pitched and mocking, and it slid down Jade's spine like ice water. "A mirror," Darius gasped, pressing a knuckle beneath his eye to catch a tear of pure amusement. "She left you a broken, haunted-looking mirror. Good God, Jade. I always told you playing the devoted little niece was a waste of time. Bea was completely senile at the end." "Oh, Jade, darling," Sylvia cooed, every syllable soaked in condescension. "If you need a truck to haul that piece of junk to the city dump, I suppose I could lend you a few dollars from the gold reserves." The humiliation scorched Jade's cheeks scarlet. It wasn't the absence of money that stung, it was the public indignity of the bequest, amplified, sharpened, weaponized by her own family. She looked at Attorney Caldwell, searching for something. A codicil, a hidden account, anything. But the lawyer offered only a glance of mild, professional pity and closed the folder. "That concludes the reading," Caldwell said quietly. Jade rose to her feet. Her legs felt half numb beneath her, but she locked her spine straight. She looked at her brother, already pulling out his phone, probably dialing a real estate broker. She looked at Sylvia, practically vibrating with excitement. "I'll have it moved out of the house by the end of the week." "Darius," Jade said. Her voice came out remarkably steady, despite the storm tearing through her chest. "See that you do," Darius replied without lifting his eyes from the screen. "I have appraisers coming Monday. I don't want them tripping over your trash." 4 days later, Jade steered her beat-up Honda Civic up the winding, overgrown driveway of the Salem estate. The house looked different without Aunt Bea breathing inside it. The looming gables and dark slate roof felt aggressive now, unwelcoming. When she turned the key in the heavy oak front door, the smell struck her immediately, dust and neglect, thick as wool. Darius had clearly already been through. Boxes sat stacked haphazardly in the parlor. Tags dangled from antique furniture. He was gutting the place, stripping it bare for a ruthless, impersonal sale. Jade walked into the grand foyer, and there it stood, leaning against the faded floral wallpaper, her inheritance. It looked even more grotesque than she remembered. The wood had gone nearly black with age, caked beneath a century of accumulated grime. Gargoyles carved into the upper corners seemed to glare down at her, mocking, patient. The glass was thick and warped, throwing back a distorted, wavy image of Jade's exhausted face. She stepped closer and pressed her palm flat against the cold wood. She whispered into the empty house. No answer came, only the settling groans of old timber. Jade had hired 2 local movers, Dave and Tommy, to transport the beast. When they arrived and got their first real look at it, both men whistled low in dismay. Dave grunted, winding a thick canvas strap around his forearms. Jade said, a fierce protectiveness surged through her, sudden and surprising. This ugly thing was all she had left of the woman who had loved her. 45 minutes of swearing, sweating and strained muscle later, the 2 burly men finally wrestled the mirror through the front door and into their box truck. _23, Tommy panted, dragging the back of his hand across his forehead. __quote _24__. Jade dismissed the comment as exaggeration from an exhausted mover, tipped them generously, and followed the truck back to her modest 2-bedroom apartment in Somerville. Getting the mirror up a single flight of stairs nearly ended in catastrophe, but eventually it stood flush against the wall in her small living room. It dwarfed everything in the room. Her IKEA sofa and cheap television looked completely absurd beside it. Once the movers left, Jade stood dead center of the apartment, staring at the behemoth. Silence pressed against her from every wall. The grief she had been choking down since the lawyer's office finally cracked open. She sank to the floor, drew her knees tight to her chest, and sobbed. She cried for Aunt Bea. She cried for the cruelty of her brother. She cried for the sheer, bone-deep unfairness of all of it. When the tears finally ran dry, late afternoon sun was throwing long orange beams across the warped glass of the mirror. Jade wiped her face. Something shifted inside her, a sudden strange burst of practical energy rising from nowhere. If this monstrosity was going to live in her home, it was at least going to be clean. She filled a bucket with warm water, white vinegar, Murphy's oil soap, grabbed a stack of microfiber cloths, started with the glass, scrubbing away decades of hazy film. As the surface cleared, the flaking silver backing became even more obvious. But at least the glass was smooth under her fingers. Then she turned to the massive wooden frame, worked the oil soap deep into the intricate carvings, dragging an old toothbrush through the grime packed into the gargoyle's sunken eyes, down the sides, around to the heavy base. She moved to the thick wooden panels along the back, the part designed to sit unseen against a wall. Her cleaning cloth snagged on something. Jade froze, ran her fingertips slowly across the back panel. It was not a solid piece of wood, not what she had assumed. There was a seam, perfectly straight, impossibly tight, running the entire length of the backboard, buried beneath a thick layer of dark furniture wax and decades of compacted dust. Jade frowned. She grabbed a butter knife from the kitchen and scraped carefully along that line. Wax flaked away in dark curls, revealing a series of tiny brass screws, countersunk, set flush with the wood, invisible to anyone not looking for them. Tommy the mover's voice rang through her memory. It's like it's filled with lead. Her heart gave a strange, unexpected flutter. Why would a mirror backing be screwed shut like a vault? Normal antique furniture used nails. Tacks. Not this. And why was the frame so impossibly thick? The mirror stood nearly 10 inches off the wall. Jade ran to her utility drawer, grabbed a Phillips head screwdriver, knelt behind the mirror. The brass screws were old and stubborn. The first one refused to move. She gritted her teeth, pressed her palm hard against the screwdriver's base, and turned with everything she had. A sharp crack split the quiet apartment like a gunshot. The screw broke free. She worked feverishly for the next 20 minutes. Her hands cramped around the handle as she extracted screw after screw. 16 heavy brass screws in total. When the last one dropped silently onto the carpet, Jade took a long breath. She wedged her fingers into the seam, feeling the dense, heavy wood of the panel beneath her fingertips. Stiff, vacuum-sealed by time and wax. She pulled harder, bracing her foot against the base of the frame. A low, groaning scrape, and the massive back panel gave way, falling backward onto the carpet with a heavy thud. Ancient dust billowed into the air. Jade coughed, waving her hands through the cloud. When it settled, she crawled forward on her hands and knees and looked inside. The mirror was not just a frame. It was a custom-built hollow casing. The cavity behind the glass was lined in dark green velvet, completely pristine, untouched by air or moisture or time. And sitting snugly within that velvet-lined tomb, stacked neatly from the base all the way to the top of the 8-foot frame, were dozens of thick, rectangular packages, each one wrapped tight in heavy, waterproof oilcloth, each one bound with thick twine. Jade's breath hitched in her throat. Her hands were trembling violently as she reached into the dark cavity and pulled out the nearest package. Heavy. She sat back on her heels and worked at the brittle twine. It snapped easily. She peeled back the layers of dark oilcloth. Inside, a thick stack of paper. But not just any paper. Jade stared at the intricate steel-engraved borders, the watermarks, the heavy Gothic font. She recognized them from a finance class she had taken years ago in college. bearer bonds, and beneath the first stack of bonds, a manila folder containing original stock certificates, impossibly old. She drew the top certificate free. The ink had surrendered most of its pigment to time, but the bold typeface stamped across the header, that was unmistakable. 10,000 shares. A holding company she recognized immediately. Because she knew as documented fact, that it had been swallowed whole by one of the largest multinational technology conglomerates on Earth sometime in the early 1980s. And beneath that certificate, pressed flat against the velvet, sat an envelope. Thick, cream-colored stationery, the kind Aunt Bea always used. Jade's fingers shook as she broke the seal. Inside, a letter. That familiar, looping handwriting, every curve a fingerprint of the woman who wrote it. My dearest Jade, if you are reading this, it means two things. First, that I am gone, and second, that my wretched nephew Darius and his vapid cousin have shown their true colours at the reading of my will. Let them have the bricks and mortar. Let them have the trinkets in the bank. They are fools, Jade. They only see what is placed directly in front of them. I have spent my life guarding a secret, waiting for someone who possessed the patience, the humility, and the character to look beyond the surface. I knew it would be you. What you hold in your hands is the true Gallagher fortune, untraceable, unrecorded, and utterly yours. Jade's gaze fell from the page to the velvet cavity below. The oilcloth packages rose in a dense, towering column, 40 of them, maybe 50. This wasn't thousands of dollars. As she began to calculate, slowly, methodically, the sheer volume of bearer bonds and original unsplit shares of a blue-chip tech monolith accumulated across 4 decades, the number built and built until it broke through every ceiling she had ever imagined. Jade Harrington was staring at hundreds of millions of dollars. For 3 agonizing days, she did not sleep. She called in sick to her data entry job at State Street Corporation, locked her apartment door, drew the blinds tight. The terrifying, suffocating reality of the wealth stacked across her living room held her in place like a hand pressed to her chest. She removed every single oilcloth package from the antique mirror. One by one, catalogued each item on a cheap legal pad, her handwriting growing shakier with every entry. The inventory was staggering. Hundreds of U.S. Treasury bearer bonds, the anonymous, untraceable instruments of wealth that the ultra-rich had favored before the government ceased issuing them in 1982. No registration, no name attached. Whoever gripped the physical paper owned the debt. Period. But the crown jewel of the collection lived in the corporate certificates. Aunt Bea had been an early, ferocious investor during the 1980s tech boom. Tucked inside the velvet casing were physical, unsplit shares of Apple Computer Incorporated, acquired shortly after its 1980 IPO. Alongside those sat thousands of shares of Berkshire Hathaway Class A stock. When Jade factored in decades of stock splits, reinvested dividends, and compound growth, the number landed like a sledgehammer, approximately $246 million in paper. In her apartment, in Somerville, she understood immediately that she was in enormous danger. If word slipped out, she'd become a target overnight. If Darius or Sylvia caught wind of this, they would drag her into predatory litigation for the next decade, claiming Aunt Bea had been of unsound mind when she hid it all. Jade needed a fortress. She needed a legal shield no one could pierce. Thursday morning, she dressed in her most conservative navy suit, steadied her hands. Then she packed a single $100,000 bearer bond and 1 Apple stock certificate into a worn leather satchel. Everything else stayed locked inside a heavy steel fire safe, purchased 2 days earlier, in cash, from a store she'd never visit again. She did not go to Harrison Caldwell, the ancient estate attorney who had served the Gallagher family for decades. That man belonged to a world that had already decided she didn't matter. Instead, Jade took the T downtown to the Prudential Tower. She walked through the gleaming glass doors of Ropes & Gray, one of Boston's most elite and most ruthless law firms. She had done her research. She asked for one person by name: Arthur Pendleton, senior partner, specialist in ultra-high net worth asset management and corporate trusts. Arthur Pendleton was the kind of man who looked like he had emerged from the womb wearing a tailored Brioni suit. When Jade was finally escorted into his corner office, floor-to-ceiling windows, skylines sprawling behind him, he offered a polished, practiced smile. It did not reach his eyes. She could feel it. He had already categorized her: small-time client, someone who had wandered past her depth.
"Miss Harrington," Pendleton said, glancing at his Rolex, and the gesture hit her like a slap, because it was the same dismissive flick Darius used. "My assistant mentioned you have a complex estate issue. How can Ropes & Gray assist you today?" Jade said nothing. She opened the satchel, drew out the manila folder, slid 2 antique documents across the polished mahogany desk. Pendleton looked at them. His professional smile disappeared. He lifted the bearer bond toward the light, studying the intricate steel-engraved watermark with narrowed eyes. Then his gaze shifted to the Apple certificate. He swallowed hard, Adam's apple pressing visibly against his silk tie. His voice had dropped a full octave. Jade said quietly. Her voice didn't waver. "And I have 48 more packages, exactly like this one, sitting in a secure location. By my amateur calculation, the total asset value comes in just shy of 250 million. I need authentication. I need the shares digitized. I need every matured bond cashed. And I need all of it done with absolute, airtight anonymity." She paused. "I want a blind trust, Mr. Pendleton. An ironclad wall between me and this money." Pendleton stared at her. Every trace of condescension had been scraped clean from his face. "Miss Harrington," he breathed, "I believe we can accommodate you." What followed was 3 months of covert financial maneuvering, unlike anything Jade had imagined. Pendleton arranged a private armored transport through Brinks to move the remaining contents of the Mirror from Jade's apartment into a subterranean vault at Bank of America. A team of forensic accountants and brokers went to work, quietly. Because bearer bonds are heavily regulated today to prevent money laundering, Ropes & Gray had to navigate the Treasury Department with surgical precision. They proved the chain of custody through Aunt Bea's letter and the time-stamped, factory-sealed condition of the Mirror's backing. As the funds began to legally materialize, Jade established Mahogany Holdings LLC, a completely blind trust managed by Pendleton. She quit her job at State Street Corporation, cited personal reasons. But she didn't buy a yacht, didn't buy a penthouse. She stayed in her Somerville apartment, and she waited. Because while Jade was quietly assembling an empire, Darius and Sylvia were walking straight into a trap Aunt Bea had built from beyond the grave. Arthur Pendleton had conducted a quiet audit of the Gallagher estate's public records at Jade's request. What he uncovered made Jade laugh until she wept. Aunt Bea hadn't merely hidden her wealth inside the Mirror, she had weaponized every visible asset she left behind. Those Back Bay commercial properties Darius had gloated over, Aunt Bea had taken out massive, high-interest commercial mortgages against them years earlier. She'd funneled that cash into untraceable bonds. Worse still, an EPA inspection triggered by Darius's attempt to sell the buildings revealed extensive hazardous asbestos contaminating the entire HVAC system. The properties were legally unsellable until a $3 million remediation was completed. Sylvia's fate carried an even darker poetry. The gold reserves and antique jewelry locked in the First National Bank safety deposit boxes had all been pledged as collateral. Aunt Bea had secured a string of personal loans from J.P. Morgan Chase against every last piece. When Sylvia tried to claim the jewels, the bank slapped her with a lien on the spot. They hadn't inherited an empire. They had inherited a financial time bomb. Autumn settled across New England, painting the trees in brilliant amber and crimson. 6 months had passed since the reading of the will. Jade sat in the back of a sleek black town car, watching the familiar iron gates of the Salem estate draw closer. The property looked worse than she'd ever seen it. The lawn was dead. Foreclosure notices were stapled to the front door. Darius's financial ruin had been spectacular and swift. Unable to unload the toxic commercial properties, the crushing mortgage payments drained his personal savings entirely.
Desperate to save himself, he'd leveraged the Salem mansion, only to discover its foundation was crumbling beneath him. Bankrupt and cornered, he'd been forced to list the family home for a public absolute auction to satisfy his creditors. Jade stepped out of the car. She wore a tailored slate-grey cashmere coat, dark sunglasses. She looked nothing like the mousy, grieving girl from the lawyer's office 6 months ago. Arthur Pendleton walked faithfully beside her, carrying a slim leather briefcase. A small crowd had gathered on the dead lawn, local real estate vultures, curious neighbors. Standing on the porch, looking haggard and 2 decades older, was Darius. Sylvia stood next to him, clutching a cheap trench coat around herself. Her designer bags had been pawned long ago. The auctioneer, a loud man gripping a microphone, launched into the proceedings. Quote, 33. Quote, 34. Quote, a local developer called out. Someone else shouted. The bidding crept upward. 1.8 million. Darius looked physically ill. At that number, it wouldn't touch even half the debts tethered to the estate. He was staring at financial ruin. Arthur Pendleton stepped forward. His voice sliced through the crisp autumn air with the kind of authority that only decades of corporate law can sharpen. $3 million. A pause. Cash. The crowd went quiet, then murmured. The developer shook his head and backed away. The auctioneer's gavel cracked down. Underscore, quote, underscore, 38, underscore. Darius's shoulders dropped with temporary relief. He descended the porch steps toward Pendleton, forcing a desperate, salesman grin onto his face. Thank you, sir. I'm Darius Harrington. You've purchased a wonderful piece of history. Who are you representing? Pendleton didn't take his hand. He simply stepped to the side. Jade walked forward and pulled off her sunglasses. Darius froze mid-stride. Every drop of color left his face. Sylvia choked out a strangled, bewildered gasp. Underscore, quote, underscore 40, underscore, Jade said, her voice smooth, unhurried, entirely unbothered. Quote, 41. Darius stammered. His eyes traveled over the expensive clothes, the private car idling behind her, the high-powered attorney standing at her shoulder. Quote, 42. Quote, 43, Jade replied. Quote, 44. Quote, 45. Sylvia shoved forward, eyes blown wide with frantic disbelief. Quote, 46. Quote. Jade smiled, not a cruel smile, but a cold one. Quote, 47. Quote. Quote, 48. Quote, Darius demanded. His voice trembled, thick with a dawning, horrifying realization. Quote, 49. Quote, 50. Jade lied, smoothly, without a flicker. She knew that revealing the exact nature of the bearer bonds would only invite years of exhausting lawsuits, even ones she'd ultimately win. But Aunt Bea left me a letter tucked behind the frame. It contained access codes to her offshore accounts she built by quietly mortgaging the properties and jewelry she left to you. The lie was cleaner than the truth, and infinitely more devastating. Darius stumbled backward as if something had struck him in the chest. He looked up at the crumbling facade of the house, then back at his sister. The full weight of his own arrogant stupidity crashed over him like a wave. He had literally laughed at her as she walked out the door, holding the key to $250 million. Sylvia broke. Loud, ugly sobs of pure, unadulterated regret tore out of her. You have until the end of the week to clear the rest of your personal belongings from the house, Darius, Jade said, turning toward her waiting town car. She paused, looked back over her shoulder. Oh, and if you need a truck to haul your things to the dump,
I suppose I could lend you a few dollars." She didn't stay to watch them shatter. She climbed into the back seat. Pendleton shut the door securely behind her. The car pulled away, rolling smoothly down the overgrown driveway. Jade gazed through the tinted window at the old Victorian mansion. She would restore it, she decided. She'd repair the foundation, strip the ugly wallpaper, make it beautiful again. And in the grand foyer, right where it had always belonged, she would place the antique Gothic mirror. Not as a hiding place anymore, as a monument to the woman who had taught her the greatest lesson of her life.
Jade stood on the porch of the Salem estate, breathing in the crisp autumn air. The house was hers now, fully restored, free of its bitter history. Darius and Sylvia had faded into resentful obscurity, crushed beneath the very greed that had blinded them. Sometimes, true value isn't found in what shines the brightest. It's found in the quiet patience to look closely at what others cast carelessly away.